I never thought I'd end up working in an amusement park, but life has a way of pushing you in unexpected directions. Funworld wasn't exactly the grandest park, no massive roller coasters, no flashy advertisements. It was just an old, local amusement park on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow the place whole once the sun went down. I needed a job, and they were hiring. That was good enough for me. The interview was quick, almost too quick. A tired-looking manager named Mr. Graves barely glanced at my resume before nodding and pushing a contract across the table. "You start tomorrow," he said flatly. As I signed the papers, he handed me a laminated sheet with 5 rules printed in bold letters. "Read these. Memorize them. They're not suggestions." I frowned. Rules for an amusement park? Seemed reasonable, but as I read them, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. Rules for working at Funworld. Never enter the park after midnight, even if you see a guest inside. Do not speak to any of the costume characters after 10 p.m. If a ride continues operating after being powered off, do not approach it. Leave the area immediately. Never enter the Hall of Mirrors alone. If you see a clown that is not on the schedule, do not acknowledge it. I let out a nervous laugh. Is this some kind of joke? Mr. Graves didn't smile. No. I waited for further explanation, but none came. "All right," I muttered, stuffing the paper into my pocket. The next evening, I arrived for my first shift. The park was closing soon, and most guests were already trickling out. The air smelled of fried food, old wood, and something else, something stale and faintly metallic. The neon lights buzzed, casting strange shadows over the cracked pavement. A senior employee named Jake met me at the entrance. He was in his late 20s, with dark circles under his eyes and an expression that screamed exhaustion. "You the new guy?" I nodded. "Yeah, I'm..." "Doesn't matter," he interrupted. "Come on. I'll show you around." The tour was standard at first: kiddie rides, food stalls, maintenance sheds. But the further we walked, the more unsettling the place became. The carousel horses had chipped paint, their glass eyes too lifelike. The funhouse entrance grinned at me with jagged, exaggerated teeth. Then we reached the Hall of Mirrors. The air felt colder here. The entrance was framed by peeling golden arches, and inside, countless mirrors stretched into infinite reflections. The dim lighting made the glass shimmer like liquid. Jake stopped. "Rule number 4. Don't go in alone." "Why?" He hesitated. "Look, just trust me. Funworld is old. Older than it should be. Some things here don't work the way they should." Before I could press further, a distorted giggle echoed from the hall. I turned to the sound, but there was only my own reflection staring back at me. Jake grabbed my shoulder. "Come on. Let's go." I followed him, trying to shake the creeping dread in my chest. We passed the Ferris wheel, its empty carriages swaying slightly despite the lack of wind. As we reached the employee lounge, a staff radio crackled to life. "Lost child reported near the carousel," a voice buzzed. Jake sighed. "Great. Let's go." We hurried back to the ride. A small figure stood near one of the horses, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, in a blue dress. Her back was turned to us. Jake stiffened. "Sir, the park is closing," he called. "Where are your parents?" She didn't move. I stepped forward. "Hey, kid, are you okay?" The carousel music started. The ride was off. The power was off. But the music played, and the horses began to move, slowly at first, then faster. The girl turned her head, just her head, too far, too unnaturally far. My breath caught. Her face was wrong, blurred like a smudged painting. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Run." Jake's voice was sharp, panicked. He grabbed my arm, and we sprinted. The music screeched behind us, discordant and unnatural. The girl's laughter, warped and layered, chased us all the way back to the lounge. Jake slammed the door shut. We stood there, panting. After a long silence, I managed, "What the hell was that?" Jake didn't answer. He just pointed at the crumpled rule sheet in my hand. Rule number 3, if a ride continues operating after being powered off, do not approach it. Leave the area immediately. I had my answer. The rule sheet felt heavier in my pocket now. My hands were still shaking from what I had seen at the carousel. The blurred face, the unnatural movement, the laughter that didn't belong to just one child but a chorus of voices layered over one another. It wasn't possible. It wasn't real. And yet, Jake's pale face told me otherwise. We sat in the employee lounge in silence. The only sound was the hum of the vending machine in the corner. I gripped the edge of my chair, trying to process everything. What the hell was that? I finally managed to ask. Jake exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples like he had answered this question too many times before. That was your breaking rule number 3. I didn't know. Now you do. His voice was sharp, but I could tell it wasn't anger. It was fear. Look, man, you're new, so I'm going to give you a pass. But don't ever do that again. We got lucky. Lucky? My voice rose slightly. That didn't feel like luck. Jake sighed and leaned back in his chair. It could have been worse. Before I could press him on what worse meant, the door to the lounge swung open. A short, stocky woman with a clipboard and a no-nonsense expression stepped inside. Her name tag read Nancy. "Jake, new kid, you're both on cleanup duty," she said. "End of shift, standard rounds. No skipping anything." Her eyes flicked to me. "And don't forget the rules." She didn't wait for a response before turning and walking out. Jake groaned, running a hand through his hair. Fantastic. I frowned. Cleanup duty? Yeah. Trash pickup, checking that no guests are still lingering, locking up some of the smaller attractions. Should be easy. Should be. That last part didn't sit well with me. An hour later, armed with flashlights and a long metal trash grabber, we made our way through the dimly lit pathways of Funworld. Most of the rides stood eerily still, their colorful lights now dull against the darkness. The food stalls were shuttered, their bright signs flickering occasionally as if gasping their last breaths. Everything felt wrong. Jake kept a steady pace, his movements practiced and efficient. I, on the other hand, was hyper-aware of every shadow stretching along the cracked pavement. We reached the western side of the park, where the kiddie rides were. Jake stopped at a small, empty popcorn stand. "All right, we split up here." I balked. "Split up? It'll go faster," he said. "You take the arcade and the funhouse. I'll handle the bumper cars and the rest." I hesitated. The funhouse. Rule number 4. "Jake, you won't be alone," he interrupted. "Just don't go inside. Just check the entrance, make sure it's locked, and move on." I swallowed hard. All right. The arcade was uneventful. Rows of silent machines blinked lazily in the dim emergency lighting, their colorful screens frozen in mid-game. I collected a few stray cups and wrappers, dumped them into my trash bag, and left as quickly as I could. The funhouse was next. The entrance loomed ahead, the garish, oversized clown face grinning down at me. Its teeth were chipped, its eyes hollow. I shuddered. The door was shut, just as it should be. But as I stepped closer, the lights inside flickered. I froze. A figure stood just beyond the entrance, barely visible between the flashing bulbs. A tall shape, unmoving. Watching. My breath hitched. I took a slow step back. Then, the funhouse door creaked open. The figure stepped forward. Not walked, stepped, as if its joints were stiff and used to movement. The light flickered again, and I caught a glimpse of its face. It was me. No, not me. The features were the same, but the expression, it was wrong. Its eyes were too wide, its grin too sharp, stretching beyond what should have been possible. The lights went out. I ran. I found Jake near the bumper cars, my breath ragged. He saw my face and frowned. What happened? I pointed back toward the funhouse, unable to speak. Jake didn't ask any more questions. He just grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the employee lounge. Only when we were inside, door locked, did he speak. What did you see? I swallowed. I think it was me. But it wasn't. Jake exhaled sharply. Damn it. He rubbed his face. You almost broke rule number 4. I didn't respond. The funhouse door had been closed when I left. I knew it had. But as I sat there, trying to slow my breathing, a single thought crept into my mind. Had it followed me? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, my reflection, but wrong. That twisted grin, the 2 white eyes. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It had been real. I arrived at Funworld the next evening, half expecting to be told I was fired. Instead, Jake met me at the entrance, his expression grim. We need to talk, he said, pulling me aside before I could even clock in. I nodded, still shaken. What was that thing? Jake hesitated, glancing around as if making sure we weren't being watched. You almost broke rule number 4, he said. The Hall of Mirrors, it's not like the rest of the park. It doesn't just reflect you. A cold chill ran down my spine. Then what does it do? Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a revised rule sheet, identical to the first, except now, there were notes scribbled beside each rule. Rules for working at Funworld. Never enter the park after midnight, even if you see a guest inside. If you see someone inside after closing, it's not a guest. It's not human. Do not engage. Do not speak to any of the costume characters after 10 p.m. They aren't employees. If one approaches you, pretend you don't hear them. If a ride continues operating after being powered off, do not approach it. Leave the area immediately. It's trying to lure you in. Don't let it. Never enter the Hall of Mirrors alone. The reflections are not always yours. If you see one move out of sync, run. If you see a clown that is not on the schedule, do not acknowledge it. Do not speak. Do not run. Just keep working like nothing is wrong. I stared at the paper, my hands shaking. Why are you showing me this now? Because you need to understand how serious this is, Jake said. Last night could have gone a lot worse. You got lucky. Lucky. There was that word again. That night, my shift felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the old rides made my skin crawl. I kept my head down, following Jake's advice to the letter. But as the hours dragged on, the unease in my gut only grew. It got worse when I saw the clown. I was collecting trash near the Ferris wheel when I spotted it standing at the far end of the park. It wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden behind a ticket booth. Its costume was old-fashioned, with ruffled sleeves and oversized shoes. But the face, the painted-on smile, was too wide, too stretched. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. My pulse pounded. Do not acknowledge it. I turned back to my trash bag, forcing myself to focus. My hands trembled as I grabbed another empty soda cup. Crunch. The sound of a footstep on gravel. The clown was closer now. I gritted my teeth, resisting the urge to look. Just keep working. Just keep working. Crunch. Another step. A sickly sweet smell filled the air, like cotton candy left to rot in the sun. I fought every instinct screaming at me to run. Crunch. Then, silence. I didn't dare move. I held my breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. A gust of wind blew past me, and just like that, the smell was gone. I glanced up. The clown was no longer there. My knees nearly gave out from relief. Back in the employee lounge, Jake took one look at my face and nodded knowingly. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded. "It got close." Jake sighed. "They always do. But you did good. You didn't run." I swallowed. What happens if someone acknowledges it? Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "You don't want to know." I believed him. The night ended without any more incidents, but as I clocked out, I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Whatever was happening in Funworld, it wasn't normal. I needed answers. And I had a feeling I wasn't going to like them. After my encounter with the clown, the rules weren't just words on a laminated sheet anymore. They were warnings, survival tactics. I followed them like my life depended on it, because, at this point, I was sure it did. But something was still gnawing at me. One rule stood out more than the others. Never enter the park after midnight, even if you see a guest inside. Why? What happened after midnight? I needed answers, but Jake wasn't the kind of guy to spill secrets easily. The more I pressed him, the more he brushed me off. But I could see it in his eyes. He knew something. Something bad. So I made a decision. That night, I stayed past my shift. I hid in the storage room near the staff lockers, behind a stack of unused plush toys. I kept my phone in my lap, watching the time tick closer and closer to midnight. My heart was a steady drumbeat in my ears. 11:58 p.m. The park was silent. Too silent. Even the usual distant hum of the power generators seemed muffled. The air had changed, thicker, heavier. 11:59 p.m. A sound echoed from the main plaza. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The rule had said not to enter the park after midnight, but it hadn't said anything about already being inside. 12 a.m. A soft chime rang through the park. Not an alarm, not the clock tower, something different. It was distant, yet all-encompassing, vibrating in my bones. And then I saw them. Silhouettes moving in the distance, just past the carousel. They weren't guests. They weren't employees. They were something else. Their forms flickered, like shadows cast by a fire, stretching and twisting unnaturally. They walked, but their feet didn't quite touch the ground. Some of them were small, hunched over, while others loomed tall, their limbs impossibly long. I knew I should have stayed hidden, but my body betrayed me. I shifted, just slightly, and knocked over one of the plush toys. The sound wasn't loud, but in that eerie silence, it was deafening. Every figure in the plaza stopped. And then, all at once, they turned toward me. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen under the weight of their gaze, if you could even call it that. Their faces were obscured, blurry, like trying to look through fogged-up glass. One of them stepped forward. Its movements were jagged, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. It raised a hand, or something that resembled a hand, and pointed directly at me. I finally found my legs and bolted. I tore through the empty pathways, past darkened rides and abandoned food stands. The sound of shuffling feet followed, growing closer with every step. The employee lounge. If I could just make it there. A sharp turn. A glimpse of something in the funhouse mirrors, my own reflection, staring at me with that same wrong grin. No time. Keep running. The door was just ahead. I yanked it open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door. Silence. I waited, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. I risked a glance through the small window. The figures were gone. Jake found me the next morning, slumped against the wall, too exhausted to explain what had happened. But he didn't need an explanation. He took one look at me and sighed. "You stayed past midnight, didn't you?" I nodded weakly. He ran a hand through his hair, muttering something under his breath. Then he crouched down in front of me. Listen, man. I get it. You want answers. But you're not going to like them. I swallowed. Where are they? Jake hesitated before speaking. Funworld, it doesn't shut down at night. Not really. It just changes. I frowned. Changes how? He stood up and offered me a hand. Come on. I'll tell you everything. But first, we need to make sure they didn't follow you. My blood ran cold. Follow me? Jake didn't answer. He just checked the door's lock and pulled the blinds shut. Whatever I had seen last night, it might not be gone. Jake locked the door and pulled down the blinds, his jaw set tight. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. Like he had been expecting this. What do you mean, follow me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake exhaled sharply. They don't always stay in the park. Sometimes, if you break the rules, they notice you. My stomach twisted. And sometimes, they don't let go. I shook my head. No, I made it inside. The door was shut. They were gone. Jake didn't argue. He just walked over to the desk and grabbed a notepad, flipping to a blank page. Tell me exactly what you saw. Every detail. I recounted everything, the way the air had thickened at midnight, the way those figures had moved, how one of them had pointed at me. I told him about the sick feeling in my gut, the way my own reflection had smiled at me from the funhouse mirror. Jake scribbled notes as I spoke, nodding along like he was hearing a checklist of symptoms. When I finished, he tapped the end of his pen against the paper, thinking. You're not the first person to see them, he finally said. You won't be the last. My hands clenched into fists. Then tell me what they are. Jake sighed. I don't know. I scoffed. Bullshit. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something behind his usual calm demeanor. Fear. I mean it, he said. I don't know what they are, but I know they've always been here. Funworld isn't just a theme park. It's older than that. Whatever this place was before, it left something behind. I swallowed hard. And now they want me? Jake hesitated. Not yet. But they're watching. The next few nights were unbearable. Every shift, I felt eyes on me. The shadows seemed longer, darker. Rides would hum with life when no one was near them. The carousel music would play in slow, distorted notes. And then there were the reflections. At first, it was small things. My reflection moving a second too slow. A grin lingering on my face when I wasn't smiling. But then it got worse. One night, as I was locking up the arcade, I caught sight of myself in the glass. My reflection wasn't just delayed, it was different. It was staring at me. I stepped closer, heart hammering. So did it. I raised a hand. It didn't move. It just grinned, wide and stretched, like it was barely holding itself together. I ran. I found Jake near the food stalls, shoving his hands into his pockets when he saw me coming. It happened again, didn't it? I nodded, trying to catch my breath. It didn't move like me. Jake cursed under his breath. We need to end this. Now. I frowned. And what? He looked around, making sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in. There's a way to break the connection. A way to make them lose interest. My blood ran cold. Ow! Jake's jaw tightened. You have to make them think you're already gone. I blinked. What does that mean? You have to disappear, he said. For real. No one can see you. No one can hear you. You have to be a ghost for a full night. I stared at him, my breath coming fast. That's insane. Maybe, he admitted. But it's the only thing that works. The next night, I didn't exist. I didn't clock in. I didn't answer my phone. I found a hiding spot deep in the staff storage area, surrounded by crates of unused merchandise, and I stayed there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even breathe too loudly. The park was different that night. I could feel it. The air was heavier, charged with something unnatural. I could hear faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. At one point, I swear I heard my own name. I didn't move. The hours dragged on. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Then 2. At 3 a.m., the air shifted. The pressure in my chest lifted, just slightly. The whispers faded. The heavy silence of the park returned. I waited until sunrise before I finally emerged. Jake was waiting for me at the employee lounge, arms crossed. He searched my face carefully. "Did you see them?" I shook my head. "No." He let out a slow breath. "Good." I frowned. "Is it over?" Jake hesitated, then nodded. "For now." I didn't like the sound of that. That was a week ago. Things have been quieter since then. The reflections are normal again. The park still feels wrong, but at least I don't feel like something is breathing down my neck every second. But last night, as I was leaving, I saw something in the distance. A shadow just past the carousel. Watching. For a week, I tried to pretend everything was normal. The shadows weren't stretching toward me. The reflections weren't grinning when I wasn't. The carousel music wasn't playing long after the power had been cut. But I knew better. I knew it was just waiting. Jake had warned me that they might lose interest. Might. That word stuck in my head like a splinter. If they had given up on me, why did I still feel like something was watching me every time I turned a corner? I thought about quitting. Hell, I thought about leaving town altogether. But that's the thing about Funworld. People don't just leave. They fade. They vanish. And the world outside forgets them. I wasn't about to become one of them. So instead of running, I did what I do best. I watched back. The first real sign came 2 nights later. I was finishing up at the food court, wiping down tables, when I heard something. Not the usual creaks of the old rides or the distant hum of the Ferris wheel. Laughter. Not the fun kind. Not the kind that comes from kids running past with sticky fingers and wide eyes. This was low, slow, wrong. I turned toward the sound. Nothing. The park was empty. The last guests had left hours ago, and Jake was in the back office finishing up reports. But the laughter hadn't stopped. It had just moved. Closer. My skin prickled. My grip on the cleaning rag tightened. I forced myself to turn back to my work, to follow the rules. Do not acknowledge them. But then the lights flickered, and I felt breath on the back of my neck. I dropped the rag and spun around, heart hammering. The food court was empty. The chairs were still stacked. The counter was still closed. But there was something on the glass window. A handprint. It was too big to be mine. Too long. And it was still wet. I stepped back, forcing myself to breathe. Think rationally. Maybe it was a smudge I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe. The laughter came again. Right. Behind. Me. I ran. Jake found me outside the storage building, doubled over, trying to catch my breath. He didn't ask what happened. He just handed me a bottle of water and waited. "They're not gone," I finally managed. Jake sighed. "I know." I looked up at him. "You knew this would happen." "I hoped it wouldn't," he admitted. "But yeah." I swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" Jake hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and silver. "A key. This goes to an old maintenance tunnel under the park," he said. "It hasn't been used in years. But it's still there." I took the key, confused. "Why are you giving me this?" Because if they don't stop, Jake said, his voice grim, you're going to need a way out. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, staring at the key, replaying Jake's words in my head. A way out. Was he telling me to run? To disappear before I ended up like the others? I thought about the laughter, the breath on my neck, the handprint on the glass. I wasn't sure if I had a choice anymore. But one thing was clear. Whatever was in Funworld wasn't done with me yet. The key burned a hole in my pocket the next night. Every time I reached for my phone, my fingers brushed against the cold metal, a silent reminder that I had a choice to make. Run or go deeper. Jake's words haunted me. If they don't stop, you're going to need a way out. But what if I didn't want to escape? What if I wanted answers? The tunnels beneath Funworld weren't just an emergency exit. I could feel it in my gut. There was something down there. Something they didn't want me to see. At 11:45 p.m., I made my move. I grabbed a flashlight from the supply closet, tucked a crowbar into my belt just in case, and made my way to the maintenance entrance. The park was silent, the rides frozen in eerie stillness. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel path. The door to the tunnels was hidden behind the old Ferris wheel, obscured by overgrown vines and rusted metal. I fit the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click. The door swung open, revealing a set of concrete steps leading into absolute darkness. I hesitated. The air drifting up from below smelled damp, old, like earth left untouched for decades. A sane person would have turned around. But I had long since crossed the line of sanity. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The tunnel stretched far beyond the reach of my flashlight, disappearing into endless black. The walls were lined with pipes, some still dripping water, others corroded beyond recognition. My footsteps echoed, too loud in the confined space. After a few minutes, I found something strange, old posters for Funworld, but not like the ones we use today. These were different. The mascots had the same wide eyes, the same exaggerated smiles, but there was something off. Their grins were too wide. Their eyes, too dark. And beneath one of the posters, scrawled in thick black marker, were 4 words. Don't listen to them. I shuddered and moved on. Deeper into the tunnel, the air grew colder. My breath misted in front of me. That's when I heard it. A whisper. At first, it was just the wind through the pipes. But then it grew louder. Distinct. A voice, hoarse and desperate. Turn back. I spun around, heart hammering. The tunnel behind me was empty. But the whispering didn't stop. It came from all around me now, seeping from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. They see you. They know you're here. I gritted my teeth and pressed forward. Whatever was waiting for me at the end of this tunnel, I needed to see it. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a rusted metal door. A faded sign hung above it. Funworld staff only. I hesitated, then reached for the handle. Locked. I pulled the crowbar from my belt and wedged it into the doorframe. With a grunt, I forced the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room beyond wasn't just an abandoned storage space. It was a control center. A massive panel of monitors lined the far wall, flickering with static, some displaying grainy footage from the park above. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room was a chair. Strapped into it was a figure, clad in an old Funworld uniform, their heads slumped forward. I took a step closer, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The figure twitched. I staggered back, biting back a scream. Then, slowly, it lifted its head. The face looking back at me was mine.